ever wondered why are there so many different types of HTTP methods for making REST APIs? There's GET, there's POST, there's DELETE, there's PUT, and there's hell lot more, right? Or do you just use POST request for everything, which you should not? So let in this particular video, we are going to see when should we use which HTTP method to make sure that you know what to use where. All right. So let us just dive into it. By the way, if you're new here, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit all different buttons on the screen. All right. Also, I would be sticking the link to this Medium article that I have written in the description. So if you like reading articles or blogs, you can go through the Medium article. If you like watching videos, of course, you're already here. All right. So there are n number of HTTP methods provided, right? So a total of 8 HTTP methods are present in Mozilla Docs by itself. So what are those? There's a GET request, there's a HEAD request, there's a POST, PUT, DELETE, CONNECT, options, and patch, right? Now you might ask, Apurva, why exactly do we need so many HTTP methods, or what exactly is the difference between all these different methods, right? So that is exactly what we are going to look into. That is the objective of this whole particular video. So let us see different use cases for when to use different requests. Cool. Now starting up with GET, the most popular one, right? You might have seen GET almost everywhere in almost every application. So what, for example, whenever you write some URL here, the request that is hit, for example, if I write google.com, right? So when I write google.com, internally it hits a GET request to google.com and fetches the website for us, right? So that is how much popular this particular request is. So as I told you in the example, a GET request should be used to retrieve part of the resource or all of the resources, right? So let's take a step back actually. Everything in the API universe, right, is built around the concept of resource. Now, what is a resource? A resource is some external entity, not external to our system, but usually external uh, to our backend application, right, which is not part of our backend application. So, some external entity that provides or stores some amount of information, right? So it can be a database, it can be another server, right? It can be a third party application. So a resource can essentially be anything that can share you some amount of information, right, with whom you want to interact. So now for this interaction to happen, we build APIs, right? So that client can interact with the resource and do different types of operation on it. So you can update a resource, you can delete a resource, you can retrieve the current state of resource, you can retrieve parts of the resource. So all these different things are possible through APIs, and you can see everything is built around the concept of resource. All right. Now let's jump back into what we were doing. So we're talking about GET API. So GET API is pretty straightforward. GET API, as the name suggests, gets the resource, right? It gets some part of the resource or it gets all of the resource according to your use case. So if you need to retrieve information from the resource, in that scenario, you should use the GET request. Cool. Now the next one, the next request is the HEAD request. I think it is fairly less popular in the industry. So the ones who also know about it are very confused between when to use HEAD and when to use GET. All right. Before I tell you about what a HEAD request is, you should know that a basic HTTP response includes two things, at least two things. That one is the headers, and second is the response body, right? So headers include information about the resource and include information about the API that was being called, right? Plus the response body includes actual content that you were asking for. So it includes the actual information that you were requesting. All right. So basically, the header includes the metadata and body includes the actual content. So when you make a GET request, you get both headers and the content. But when you use a HEAD request, it gives you only the headers, right? So it is very similar to a GET request, but it only returns the response headers. That's it. You might be wondering, what's the point of using this request, right? When in my life would I come across a scenario where I need to get only the headers, but not the actual content? Fair enough, right? So let me tell you a scenario when you will need it. So for example, you have something stored on your S3 bucket, right? So you have a PDF stored on your S3 bucket. Now this PDF is pretty huge in size, and which is very common for PDFs to have. So you wouldn't want to fetch the whole PDF when you just want to check whether it exists or not, right? It would be very inefficient, and plus it would take a lot of time. What you want to do is you just want to make a check whether this particular file exists in my S3 bucket, correct? So in that scenario, you are not really interested in fetching the request body, but you are interested in just checking whether it exists or not, which you can know directly through your response headers. So this is one scenario where you can use a head HTTP request. That is, if you wish to check if a resource exists, right? Another scenario that comes to my mind is basically if you want to simply ping a URL, right? So you have created a bunch of APIs. You have created a REST controller. It has a bunch of APIs inside. You just want to check whether this particular REST controller is working, right? You're not, so in that scenario, you are not really interested in getting the request body. Rather, you just want to get some response to know that the particular service is alive, right? So that in that scenario, you can use the head request to just make a call to our particular service and get a response which contains only the headers, but it is good enough to tell us that the particular request is alive, right? A particular service is alive. So the health check kind of APIs can also be written using head. All right, now you know what head does. Another popular HTTP request header request method is post. Right, now one common difference between post and put in the industry is that post should be used whenever you need to create a new entity in your resource. So for example, if you need to create a new record in the existing table, right, of your database, or maybe you just want to create a new table by itself in your DB. So whenever something new is getting created, you should use post request, right? So notice here that I'm saying creation and not updation, right? So creation and not updation, because a put request is something you should use for updation. So for example, there's an existing entry and you want to update a column inside that. So in that scenario, using a put request is better than a post request. Or now instead of, I would say better, is a standard convention, right? So anyone making a call to your resource using a post request and using a put request knows what exactly they are doing or what exactly is going to happen. All right, remember, post for creation and put for updation. Okay, now, I mean, delete seems pretty much common. As the name suggests, delete is used to delete an entry or a set of entries or even the resource itself, right? So any delete operation should go through the delete HTTP method. All right, now, yeah, connect is another one of the lesser known or less popular HTTP methods, but it also has a specific use, right? So let me just take you through it. For example, you have a resource, right? You have a resource that is banned in your country. Okay, so you have a resource that is banned in your country. So what do you do to access it, right? So what you do is you use a proxy server. So what does a proxy server mean? Basically, there's a server. I send my request to the server and server relays my request to the particular resource, right? So when resource receives my request, it thinks that it has received it from the proxy server, which has access to it, but I don't, right? So it gives the response to the proxy server. In similar fashion, proxy server returns the response, relays the response from the actual resource to me. And that is how the whole flow works, right? So if you want to understand this in detail, actually, so there's a YouTube video by a really good guy. Let me just check.
Why? Because it's unencrypted. So
Yeah, so this one, a video by Hussein Nasir, which tells you about what HTTP tunneling is. So what I just told you is the same thing. So there's a client machine, there's a server, and there's a resource. So you send your request to the server relays it to the resource sends it back, and everything comes back the same way it went, right? So this concept that I just told you about is called proxy forwarding, right? So is a connect request is very important when you want to do proxy forwarding. So on your server, the proxy server, you would run a connect HTTP method against your target IP. Now target IP is basically IP of your resource, right? So connect target IP. This will create a session between your target IP or between your resource and your proxy server. Once the session is established, whenever you send a request to your proxy server, the proxy server will relate to your resource, and the basically the HTTP tunneling will happen successfully. Cool. So I hope this brings some clarity into your head, and I would really suggest you to check this video out, man. This dude is great for explaining the same thing. Okay. Now let's look at what options mean. So we have down to our last two HTTP methods, that is options and patch. Now, similar to how head works, what does head return? Head returns your headers, right? Not the body. But headers also come in two types, right? So header contains metadata, but their metadata is of two types. So one metadata is about your resource, and another metadata is about the API that we are calling to operate on the resource, right? So there's a metadata about the resource and metadata about the API. Now, when you use the head request, it returns the metadata of the resource. But when you use the options request, it returns the metadata about the API. So one common scenario would be if you want to retrieve the course restriction, right? The cross origin restrictions on the particular API that you are trying to hit, right? So you want to know whether what methods are allowed for hitting this particular API. So that can be fetched from the options request, right? So to retrieve the metadata about API, make sure you use options. To retrieve the metadata about the resource, make sure you use head. Okay. Now to the last one, that is patch. Now again, a post, put, and patch request. These three are very similar to each other and can create a lot of complexity. But remember, post is only for creation. So post is out of the picture. Now, put and patch are both used for updating an entry in a resource, right? But updating an existing entry. But the difference lies here is that put is capable to update a part of resource or a set of entries, or it can also update a few columns at one time. Yeah, so there's no restriction on what amount of updation or what size of updation a put request would do, right? So it can do the smallest of the updations to a wide scale updation across multiple tables, multiple columns, multiple entries, right? So put can do whatever you want. A patch request is very specific. A patch request usually contains the ID of the entry. It usually contains the column that you want to update. So a put request is usually created when you want to update one single cell in a table in a resource, right? Smallest cell. So if I want to update a particular column of a particular entry of a particular table in a DB, that is when I use patch, right? A patch request usually has all this information in its URL itself, right? So in that way, I feel patch request is also less secure, but then again, yeah, you can find ways around it. So when you need to do something that is granular, you use patch request. But when you need something that is a bit more less restrictive, or you want to do a kind of batch update, in that scenario, you would use a put request. I hope this clarifies the basically all the different 8 HTTP methods to you. There's one more called trace, but I feel trace is not really in the scope of this video, since trace is pretty much deprecated, I would say. Yeah. So yeah, meet you next time. I hope you took something through this video, something that is useful for you. And bye.